Good day, everyone. I am Charin Maingaling Balaba, and today I'm going to report about properties of starch, syneresis, and retrogradation. Starch is the second most abundant carbohydrate served in plants, serving as the major storage for carbon and energy. Starch contains two major glucose polymers. But first, let's define what is glucose polymers. A glucose polymers is an extended chains of glucose, otherwise known as starch and cellulose. So there are two glucose polymers, namely the amylopectin and the amylose. Next is the properties of starch. This includes the gelatinization, gelation, retrogradation, and syneresis. But in this report, I will only focus on the retrogradation and syneresis as one of the properties of starch. Why does bread have a hard texture when it aged? We probably observed or eaten a 3-day-old bread, and as we observed, aged bread have a hard and dry texture, and retrogradation and syneresis are the properties responsible in this phenomenon. But first, let's define what is retrogradation and syneresis. Retrogradation is a chemical reaction that takes place when amylose and amylopectin chains in cooked gelatinized starch realign themselves when cooling the starch sample. Syneresis, on the other hand, is characterized by the expulsion of moisture from the gel. This reaction occurs in all kinds of gels. Starch consists of two polysaccharides, the monosaccharide polymers and glucose. The two polymers of starch are amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is a straight chain as shown in the picture. Next, we have the amylopectin structure, which has a branch-like structure, and it is thought to look like a tree as shown in the picture. As shown in the picture, this is a starch granules which have an organized amylose and amylopectin tree. When starch granules are dropped in a cold water, nothing really happens. But when the water is heated, the starch granules absorb water, which naturally begins to swell. The starch granules explode, releasing amylose to the outside of the granule as water absorption and heating proceed, allowing the amylopectin to be less orderly, and other amylose loses its helix as shown in the picture. This happens when temperature of a starch slurry is above the temperature of gelatinization, which is 62 to 70 degrees Celsius for cornstarches and 59 to 67.5 degrees Celsius for potato starch. And as the starch is cooled, and if no stirring occurs, a gel is formed, and eventually by this, retrogradation will occur. This is the structure of retrogradation. Anyone who tried to store their cornstarch, custard, or gravy on their fridge has observed the effect of retrogradation and gelation. The starch gel shrinks and a water layer forms on the surface. The release of water during retrogradation is called syneresis. Gelation is caused by the amylose become reordered, and retrogradation is caused by amylopectin to be reordered. In the question, in syneresis, where the water came from? In cooking, syneresis is a sudden release of moisture contained within the protein molecules, usually caused by excessive heat, which overhardens the protected shell. Moisture inside expand upon heating the hard protein shell, pops, expelling the moisture. And what causes reorder of the amylopectin during retrogradation. When starch is heated in the presence of water and subsequently cooled, the um, the disruption amylose and amylopectin chains can gradually reassociate into a different order structure in a process termed as retrogradation. So this is an example of a bread that undergoes retrogradation and syneresis. As observed on the picture, the bread have a dry texture. This is because of the release of its moisture, which is termed as syneresis, and the retrogradation is responsible for its hard texture. So these are another example of food products that undergoes retrogradation and syneresis. These two properties are observable in yogurt and jellies. So in the question, what comes first, retrogradation or syneresis? It is syneresis because during this phenomenon, water is released, causing the product like bread to change its texture over time, which is termed as retrogradation. So there are factors that influence syneresis and retrogradation processes, namely water content, starch source, and storage condition. So how does these factors influence the syneresis and retrogradation process? When the water content is below 20% or above 90%, there will be no retrogradation observed in a corn or wheat starch. But if the water content will be reduced to 80%, retrogradation will occur for non-waxy corn starch but not observed in waxy corn starch. Starch source. Many additives are used to retard retrogradation of starch in foods, and these additives are carbohydrates, salts, amino acid, protein, peptides, lipids, and other components that is influence retrogradation by inhibiting of retrogradation of rice, wheat, sweet potato, oat, corn, and tapioca starch. And the last factors that influence the retrogradation is the storage condition. The onset temperature and enthalpy change for the melting of retrograded starch molecules increase with storage time at constant temperature, whereas the conclusion temperature inhibits little change. What type of starch do not undergo retrogradation? Waxy high amylopectin starches have much less tendency to retrograde. Additives such as fat, glucose, sodium nitrate, and emulsifier can reduce retrogradation of starch. For a year up until now, syneresis and retrogradation are one of the problems in culinary because it contributes to the hard texture of a bread and the release of water in jellies, jams, puddings, and many more. But in the other hand, retrogradation and syneresis is a useful property of starch not just by cooking a fried rice but also in pastries like bread. Like for example, freshly baked bread that smells incredible out of the oven. Before you cut it, you will let the loaf bread cool to get its desirable texture. But those minutes that we've been waiting, syneresis and retrogradation actually happens. As the bread cools down, it releases its moisture, and this process is called syneresis. While in the other hand, the cooled bread that turns its texture into hard, sliceable, and chewable structure is the product of retrogradation.